Okay. Just before we start the tutorial, are there any queries or questions with respect to the major essay that anyone might have?
Liz, in the learning guide, it appears that 8 references is the minimum for the major essay. Does it matter how old they are, like what they are? Like, are they specific to journal articles, or is it books included, and like how's that work?
Okay, so we'll need to, you'll need to ensure that the sources that you use are reputable and they follow the expectations around academic research and literature sources that can be used as evidence. So in terms of currency, what we actually say there is that you look at a 5-year time frame or window in terms of how recent the publications are or the sources are, knowing that, you know, there's a little bit of flexibility in that, in the sense that if the law hasn't changed since then, particularly when you're looking at something like legislation, it might well be outside of that 5-year time frame. So that would be fine to use if it's outside of that particular window, but certainly in terms of the type of sources that you use, it's not specific to journal articles. It can be government websites. It can actually be the journal articles. It can be government publications, as long as it's reputable sources that you're using. That was a very long-winded answer, but yeah.
No, that's fine. Thank you, Liz.
No, that's okay. Any other questions or queries?
Can I just double check if the references is included in the word count or not?
Okay, so the in-text references would be included, Stephanie, but not your reference list.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, all right, well, I have taken the roll, so we might start with our presentation, and there'll be some time most likely at the end in the event that something else has come up that you'd like to ask with respect to the essays. But for now, I'll hand over to our group presenting.
Sorry, Liz, just to interrupt, so I came a bit late, so I missed the roll call. Sorry about that.
Okay, Aidan, I've got you down. No problem.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, hi guys, can you hear me?
Only just, Josh. You might want to put up the volume just a little bit if you can, or bring it closer to you.
Is that better?
It is for me.
It is here, awesome.
I can hear.
So we're going to do Designer Babies with our presentation. So I'm Joshua, we have Zuka, and we have Mona. And we're just going to share our screen now, I hope. So is that sharing?
It is, thank you.
Awesome, cool. Okay. Yeah, so we're doing a case study via Designer Babies. So today we're going to talk about what a designer baby is. So we're going to go through a definition. We're going to have a look at modifications for health. We're going to look a little bit at Saviour siblings, and then we'll go on to gender selection and selection attributes. So we'll go through quite a variety, and we'll also look at the legal perspective. We have got a Go soapbox as well. So I believe the code's in the chat, and it's on the screen as well. So I'll just give you guys a second just to get that up and running.
Okay.
All right, so are we all ready? Yep, all right, so we'll move on.
What do you think of designer babies? Any definition in mind? Anyone?
Is it just babies when they've altered the genes before they were born?
Yeah, that's correct. So
A baby whose genetic makeup has been selected in order to eradicate a particular defect or to ensure that a particular gene is actually presented. So yes, that's kind of definition of designer babies. Pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, known as BGD, is a type of assisted reproductive technology, which the steps are: female undergoes fertility treatment to stimulate production of eggs. Then eggs are collected and fertilized. Fertilized eggs go through mitosis until 8-cell stage, and then 1 or 2 cells are removed from each embryo for genetic assessment. Embryos carrying the defective genes are discarded, and normal embryos are re-implanted into female. The unused embryos are frozen for future use.
So this is the primary way in which designer babies are created today. However, there are some other ways as well.
So I'll go through the first article that we have. I've had a summary. I'll just go through it. So the British government allowed screening IVF embryos for couples affected by a genetic form of bowel cancer. Previously, this test was only approved for childhood or untreatable conditions such as cystic fibrosis and Huntington's disease. However, recent changes in legislations are allowing the screening of embryos for diseases that might not develop until adulthood, have lower chances of being passed on to children, or not cause the disease, even with a high risk. So this technology will not only eliminate the risk for children, but also wipe out the defective gene entirely in future generations. For example, there is this FAP disease, which is an aggressive form of cancer, does not commonly develop until reaching 20, and surgical interventions can reduce the risk of disease development. Thus, in allowing screening for such diseases, it is argued that this technology will deny life to children who might not get the disease for decades or ever. So this was the article, the first article. And now we go to the first question, which is, do you believe that genetic modification for health is ethical? Is it? Okay, you can answer that through the Go Soapbox.
Awesome. So we have a split of 75 to 25. So I was wondering if someone from the affirmative could give their perspective on why they believe it would be ethical to genetically modify him for health reasons.
I decided to go yes, and admittedly, I think it all depends on the situation. Just to start off with, I don't think it's a specific black and white yes/no scenario, but I think in situations that it can prevent basically prevent health like disease and suffering of possible people. I think that's fair enough. And I think as a parent, that as far as autonomy goes, that if you do have the choice, you should be given the choice to basically choose if your child doesn't have something, if it will affect them, and you know that you're at risk of giving your child that.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a very common perspective. Do we have anyone from the no corner that would like to give their perspective on the topic? That's right. That's okay. I have a couple of different arguments for and against it. So we'll move on to those. Obviously.
Yeah, but first, we'll just ask like further questions to this topic. For people who answered yes, it is ethical. Well, if it is ethical to screen embryos for genetic disorders and for health, do you think that in the interest of justice, this should be provided under Medicare so everyone can access it?
I certainly think so. I think that if, particularly in view of the fact that it does also apparently protect future generations.
Yep.
I think that could be argued either way. Personally, I think that if Medicare pays for it, that if they're going to be saving themselves money at the end of the day, so I think that's definitely something that's a positive. But at the same point, as far as Medicare goes, it's just a question of how far are they responsible, basically, and like Medicare doesn't get to decide your genetics, and that's not something you have to decide either. That's just how it is. And should they be responsible for ensuring that you pass on the best of your genetics? I think that's kind of can go either way, personally.
Yes, that's an interesting point. So, so once something has been changed, who's responsible for that afterwards? And we'll go into that a little bit later on with one of the law cases which came through in around 2013 in regards to genetics. But yeah, that is a really interesting point. So obviously we've had a look at the humanitarianism perspective, where if we have the ability to do it, we should be doing it, sort of thing, and it shouldn't be restricting people's access to healthcare. And obviously we've looked at the utilitarian perspective with the Medicare. I also have a multiculturalism perspective as well. So multiculturalism or a multiculturalist would be someone who finds cultural and ethical diversity as a positive thing. Now, many of the diseases which we're looking at cure, such as blindness, deafness, and Down syndrome, they would arguably have their own cultural value within our society at the moment. So would removing that, that'd be a positive thing? I mean, like with deafness in particular, we have things like closed captioning on our TV screens, which they've brought to the situation. And then even we've got people like Stephen Hawking, who have arguably really added quite a lot to our society. Does anyone have any views on that perspective?
I don't have a view on that perspective in particular, but I just also had oh sorry, the birds in my head. Had the thought that basically regarding saving people, well, regarding genetically engineered babies, as far as a scientific perspective, disease is here for a reason. Like, there's only so much that can be in a population at one time, and from a scientific perspective, eradicating disease to the point where there's basically nothing to kill people apart from like old age can be quite detrimental environmentally and like biologically. That's a different perspective I thought of.
So the idea of survival of the fittest sort of loses.
Yeah,
because we're all fit.
Yeah, it's basically like natural selection, and if we choose that basically everything, that we can overcome everything, then everyone's going to live. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but as far as like resources and everything like that, like we'll easily overpopulate, and we're already kind of in that scenario of how much is too much.
I don't think we should get rid of everything. I think that there needs to be some deep discussion about which diseases would be screened for. I don't necessarily think that deafness or blindness or Down syndrome are necessarily one of those diseases that we would be looking at. But I think certainly when it's something that causes a great deal of pain and sorrow for the person and the family, I think that they're the sorts of things that we should be screening for.
Yeah, that's really interesting. How about in terms of the article? So diseases that may not come about. I mean, we can screen for the BARC1 gene, which is a key indicator for breast cancer. Would that be going too far then in that perspective?
I don't know. I think that that's probably food for a much more broad debate than what we have time for here. But I think, yeah, that's a good point and certainly would need further discussion.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of what this unit is about, is what is too far and what is not enough. So
Yeah.
obviously, yeah. So we have the ability, we are developing the ability to do things, and then we're not sure how far we should go. And that's sort of shown by the second argument, which is the right for life as well. Now, this one sort of depends on your perspective on when life actually begins. So in the IVF screening, some people believe that as soon as the egg is fertilised, that is classified as life, and that selecting the embryos based on that and discarding them is in some way or form killing a person, sort of thing. How do we feel about that side of the debate?
Personally, I think that's quite interesting. I believe that life doesn't start exactly from fertilization, but I think it's interesting because I'm personally a pro-choice supporter, but legally, and a fetus isn't actually alive until it's born and living without its mother. So I think it's just quite interesting also looking at the legal aspect, is that legally they don't even acknowledge the fetus as an entire living human being until it's born. I think that's just an interesting point to bring up.
Yeah, I have a similar perspective. Recently I had a baby, and well, I didn't, my wife did. And when we had the ultrasound sort of thing, and I could see the fetus in the body sort of thing, in my mind, that was already a life sort of thing. And I was a bit shocked to find out, I know we've done this in previous lectures, to find out that wasn't a life sort of thing. And it's sort of interesting. A lot of religions find it at a very different point in time when it does become life and it isn't life. And I sort of wonder if it's up to governments to define that sort of thing.
And I think even, Josh, your point is that when you have an emotional connection to said fetus, I think that's very different to just having a conversation about it legally. I think they're two very different things. It's easy to talk about it, but when, like as a woman, if you're pregnant, or as a father-to-be and father, it changes your perspective. It definitely would.
I would certainly agree with that. I think too that once you're in that situation, so if you were somebody who was diagnosed with the BRCA1 gene and had a family history of breast cancer, I think people would have a very different perspective on accessing some of these treatments and procedures, because in a family, if you have two sisters and one does and one doesn't have the gene, and then how they go, the person, when you're dealing with like a 23-year-old woman who has already lost their mother, is going in to have a breast removed to reduce her chances, they're going to want to have something like this, and they're wanting to maintain life and maintain a well and healthy life.
Yeah, awesome. That's great too. Just for the last point that I have on my slide here is that when we do modify these genes, so when we are selecting an embryo, say for example, we've been talking about the BARC1 gene, if we eliminate that gene, sometimes it does cause other diseases in the body as well that we're not entirely sure about how it all works yet. So, for example, there was a gene that we can change that makes us more resistant to the HIV virus.
Mm-hmm.
However, in modifying or selecting to get that gene, we also make us more susceptible to yellow fever. So there is also sort of that trap later on down the track that we need to consider that that changing our current genes may make something worse in the future as well. So
I think that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a sort of a much broader debate, is that making those decisions, I think, really needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. So making sort of a generalisation may not take into account some of the other issues that are involved in manipulating genetic material, including, the fact that we may know some of the things that will impact that decision, but we also may not know some of the things unless there is also research that proves that something might also be associated with great brilliance or something along those lines. Excuse me.
Awesome. All right. So I think we've really moved through this this part of the section. So we might move on to the legal section now.
Next section is savior siblings. The definition for savior sibling will be a child who conceived through selective in vitro fertilizations as a potential source of donor organs or cells for an existing brother or sister with a life-threatening medical condition. So what do you think of this? In your opinion, are savior's babies ethical? Okay, yeah. So why it's almost 50-50. No, yes, of course, and maybe we had two answers, maybe, and two no. What do you think it's no? For those who no.
I think it's no, just because they're basically being made so that they can have parts of them harvested later if they need it. Like, they might be able to live a normal life, but they have at the back of the mind the fact that they'll come a point where they'll need parts of their body being taken for their sibling.
Awesome. So you're suggesting that there'd be some sort of psychological damage that may be caused by the knowing that they're only for the spare part.
The sibling. Yeah, definitely there for the other sibling.
Awesome. Can we grab someone from the yes?
Maybe.
Yes.
Maybe.
Oh, the maybe?
Yeah.
Yep. Can we grab someone from the maybe corner as well?
I basically said maybe because in my head, it depends on how intrusive it is. Because from what I've read with savior siblings, sometimes you could be having a baby just to get something from the placenta or the umbilical cord. I forget what it's called, but like the rich blood. And I think in those sorts of cases where what you're obtaining for the sibling that's alive currently doesn't intrude upon the new sibling, I think that's fine. I think that's kind of being smart as such. But I think as far as having a savior sibling and then they donating organs or things that are intrusive upon them, I think that's then very debatable on what it is and is very specific to the circumstances.
Yeah, I agree with that too. I think it's all depends on how serious you actually need the organs and that. So like, I'm sure that a saver sibling down the track would appreciate like when they like grow up and like learn about what they did to save their brother or sister. I'm sure they'd be happy with it, but like it just seems a bit unethical to like use a newborn child like a pawn in the process. As to like it's like just let them be and let the other child be, and if natural selection says this kick, then just let it go. But I don't know.
I think. Sorry, Kate.
That's right. Go on.
I think something that's also interesting, like looking at like the legal perspective, is that like as far as if we're talking about organ donation, that can't actually happen. I don't remember, but like that can't happen for a very long time until that the saviour sibling can actually consent to it and actually like understand that. And that can be, I believe, before the age of 18 in extreme circumstances. But I think in some ways like it is, but then in other ways it's not, because at the end of the day, you're having a child to benefit your other child, and the autonomy of this new child is not really being valued as much as what is your first child, I think. So I think that's kind of hard and specific to the circumstances as well.
Yeah. I just think also because 18 years is a long time, and if the child that needs the organs like needs it now, then what's the point really? Because they might even last 18 years before that.
Yeah, but then like from what I understand with regenerative tissues, that I believe can be donated within within a few years if like all the parties consent, being mum, dad, the saviour sibling and the original sibling. So I think it is a complicated process in which everyone does actually have to be kind of on board, but at the same time, the entire idea of it is, it could be argued either way, because like the saviour siblings could become closer together, or there could be a lot of resentment towards it. And I think it's difficult to say on like a general perspective.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Actually, like, you've got to like experience the process yourself to know, like, appreciate it more, I guess. So we can talk about it all we want, but until we're actually there, like, making the decision for ourselves, it's like, it becomes harder than it is.
I don't think we can necessarily assume that a saviour sibling would be thought of any differently or loved less because of motivations necessarily. I think that's important to consider. I understand the arguments that are being put forward in that situation, but I think that it's a big call to think that would be the presumed outcome.
Yeah, no, definitely, Karen, I agree with you. The point I made, I think it's seriously case by case basis. Like, I think some parents will be honestly 100% be what you're saying, but I do think there may be some people who are so overwhelmed with stress and grief of their current child that the second child may be kind of put aside in as far as like what's best for them. And sometimes people can become tunnel visioned in stressful times, and I think that's something that would apply to some people, but obviously not all.
Before, when you were saying like all the parties have to consent, is the kid consent? Will the saviour baby consent because they want to do it, or because they've been pressured to do it because it's what they've been born to do?
I think that's kind of up to the child. I don't remember exactly what age that I read that a child can consent, but basically from what I read, it was like really like when the doctor can basically say that they're understanding what's happening. And I don't know if that means like, are you talking 10 years old? Are you talking like 7 or 8 years old? Like, and even on a case-by-case basis, like not every child's going to be at the same mental capacity at specific ages. So you don't know when like they can say, okay, we think that this child understands the situation and they can do it. And as you said, Stephanie, if you're born into it, you might have the idea, and that motivation, I have to do this.
Yeah.
And I think that that's an unfair like pressure possibly, but also it depends on the parents. Like they might say, look, we brought you into this world for this, but it's your choice. And that's just case by case how you run it basically.
Yeah, so it feels like there's something like intrinsically wrong with creating a baby just for spare parts. However, there's obviously positive benefits from it as well. My understanding from a legal perspective is that for it to actually happen, the family has to go through quite a fair bit of counselling before it actually moves forward. But anyhow, we might move forward with this with our discussion and move on to the next one.
Okay, well, the discussion covered much of the for and against points that we already had for this topic. So I'll just go through them all. For the for, we have that designer babies would save a life. And also they have the advantage of that when embryos are screened for matching, they are also screened for genetic disease through the selection process. So they have this advantage of reducing risk of genetic disease. Also, it is argued that there is no harm done to the savior sibling because the tissues or the stem cells are actually collected from the umbilical cord. We also have the reduced economic burden to the family with the associated costs of medical treatment. And also this might create a strong bond between siblings, which also might go the other way and create resentment towards the parents or the siblings. Also, it is ethically wrong to use a child as a means to an end, those who argue against. And the savior sibling might feel used in this case, and it could have like a negative psychological impact on them to know that they were used or created just for spare parts. And also there is the argument of the diminished autonomy for savior sibling, and that they did not choose this, they were forced into it. So these are the arguments that we considered, which are pretty much covered through the discussion that we just had.
So the next question that come up is, in your opinion, should the law define what a genetic disease is or is not?
Awesome. So can we get someone from the yes camp to give us their reasoning for the answer?
Right. So I said that yes, the law should define what a genetic disease is because ultimately it is the law that will have to enforce it. Because unfortunately, a doctor or someone else in the medical field, they don't have any legal grounds to enforce a diagnosis or enforce something related to the diagnosis.
Oh, awesome. That's a great point. Can we get someone from the no camp as well?
Yeah, okay. I was in the no camp because I don't think it would be the law that would define it. It would be guidelines from, there's a newly formed genomic body within Australia, and they would issue guidelines, I believe, on what a genetic disease is, what is epigenome, what is genome, exome, all those sort of things. So it would be guidelines, and also as the knowledge increases, it's going to be a movable feast as to what is a genetic condition and how that interacts over time. So also I was concerned that if it was law, then you have the possibility of eugenics coming in and slipping in along with that as well. And I don't think that would be appropriate.
Yeah, that's an awesome point, and we're gonna come back to that a little bit when we get to the attributes slide as well. So as mentioned before, the IVS version of Designer Babies is legal in Australia, and it's sort of governed by that the guidelines which were mentioned before. Some states do have it, but obviously we have the National Health medical research guidelines from the council, which is set out. They provide the guidelines on what should and shouldn't be done, and they also lease out the research and stuff that's done as well. So whether or not someone can and can't do research on the embryos as well. I'm not sure if I have it on this slide. We'll go internationally as well. So internationally, however, it's really different. There's no international guidelines. However, it is sort of has sort of been just slotted in with the cloning, the cloning international. It's like a treaty guideline sort of thing that they have, where they sort of say we're not going to do this and we're not going to do that, but it's not really enforced that much, and it's sort of self-governed. And yeah, so each country has its own different stances on it.
I have a question.
Cool.
So in your opinion, does human gene selection warrant a global agreement or laws? So what do you think of this question? Can you give us a reason why you choose no from no camp?
Yeah, I'll have a stab at this one, because if you start going into gene selection, you're going to also come across some cultural variations. So if you're starting to select for height, then you're going to be disadvantaging those groups of people that are always naturally quite short. Or if you are wanting to define eye shape, so Asian people have an extra fold in the eyelid. Do we want to start breeding that out? You know, then you start going down to, are we going to have blue eyes over brown eyes? And I don't think that is at all where this should be going.
Also, in some countries, some diseases are more prevalent in other countries than more other ones. So, like, it sort of makes no sense to like make one little uniform agreement when circumstances change from country to country to country.
But this technology has the ability to be passed down through generations and generations, and obviously the technology in one country is going different to another. Do you think that maybe that would warrant the response? So, you know, so countries such which may not be as ethically bound may feel it warrantable to change something that that globally isn't ethical.
I mean, I'm sure it wouldn't hurt the UN to like discuss the matter, but I don't think countries would actually agree to like go into the same sort of principles regarding like their own country and their own cultures and all that stuff. So like, I just think it's something to look at, but no, I don't think it's that practical.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because there was just recently the case where there was a Jewish family who lived in America, who then went to China, and what they did was that they removed the mitochondrial strands from the mother's ovum and replaced it with another person. So it was sort of called a three-parent family, and ethically it couldn't be done in America, it couldn't be done legally, but it could be done in China. So your point about legislation perhaps does have, and the ethical use of that legislation and what they will and won't do does come into play.
Yeah.
I was in the yes vote, and the reason that I said yes is I don't necessarily think that all aspects of this should be a global agreement, but I think that the discussion needs to be had globally. I don't think you can determine which genes would be selected, but definitely I think that the discussion about things around that definitely needs to be had.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, so although we don't really, the class doesn't seem to think that laws are necessary, there are obviously some some ethical considerations that we all have ourselves.
Okay, now for our next topic is gender selection, and we're gonna discuss ethical and legal issues associated with it. But first, I'm going to give a brief summary of the second article, which is related to this topic. The article examines the lack of regulation for gender selection in US fertility clinics, which lead to medical tourism from various countries where babies' gender selection for non-medical reasons is banned. One clinic offers gender selection for $20,000, and most couples seeking this procedure are affluent and able to afford the costs. Even with lack of regulation, some US doctors are still against gender selection for non-medical reasons because they consider it a form of sexism and believe medical resources should be better utilized to address real medical needs. They also raised the question of where this technology might lead and whether people will start choosing embryos based on attributions such as eye and hair color. So we'll move to the legal perspectives.
So currently, gender selection is, in Australia, it's not legal. However, there is a genetic condition. So some of the ones I found was like X-linked autism. And some other X-linked diseases, you can select it out. So you can decide to have a girl over a boy or a boy over a girl, depending on that disease and the specific situation. Globally, however, it's a bit of a mixed bag. There are quite a few countries that have banned it, such as China and India. They're two very big and prominent countries that have banned it at the time. So it is a little bit everywhere in the global department, and that's why we see a lot of the health tourism that we mentioned in the article. Interestingly, I do want to just mention CRISPR as well, because if you do Google design a baby, in the last 2 years, that's been there's been a big leap forward, like a big development in the genetic technology. So that technology allows us to introduce specific genes rather than having to select it out of the parents. And so that's a big step forward for us, and it's really brought a lot of this technology into the foreground. That technology in Australia is currently illegal, and that's under the Genetic Technology Act of Australia, which was interestingly GMOs restrictions, so genetically modified foods, and that's sort of starting to bleed into human editing as well.
Okay, so moving back to the ethical part. In your opinion, can gender selection be ethical?
Okay, you need to unlock question 5.
I did. It is unlocked.
It's unlocked?
Yes.
It's not appearing. Do you need to lock some of the other ones back up? I don't know. Is there a limit on the number of questions that?
Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we get almost 100% yes response. Why do you think it should be ethical?
I think it's ethical on the basis of basically eradicating disease which is X-linked or linked to a specific sex. I think in that case it's definitely ethical, but as far as anything else that's I've got three baby boys and I want a girl or whatever, I think as far as the social aspects, that I don't think it should be permissible to select your gender of your child unless it's for health reasons to basically ensure that they've got good health, basically.
Yeah, that's right.
Does anyone else have any opinions?
Okay.
Also, so during the research we came up from it, feminism perspective was quite a strong one, which I came through, which I found interesting. A feminist, they like the idea of it because it gives control over their own body, and it gives them that area. However, we see in China and India where sex selection, not through IVF because it's illegal in there, but however through other techniques, has resulted in quite skewed population trees. And many of the feminist groups are concerned that increases discrimination against women, and it's disempowering to them. How do we feel about that perspective?
I kind of get how it is a perspective, because definitely there's the feminist perspective, but I think at the same time there's bias towards males, and I don't think, from my understanding of feminism, as far as how women are being discriminated against, in the same token, a male could be discriminated against, and everybody could want a baby girl, but then there's these heaps of girls and there's this limited number of boys. And I think there is a point in the feminism argument, but I think it's one-sided to only looking at the discrimination of females.
So
your argument, Rhiannon. Sorry, Josh. So your argument, Rhiannon, is in the scheme of things that internationally across the globe, the bias against one gender or the other might well play out and balance itself. So, for example, in Canada, there's a predisposition to actually wanting girls as opposed to boys. And that in and of itself will mean that there's enough diversity and mix there that across the globe you'll actually get that, the neutralisation of any bias. Is that right?
That wasn't exactly my point. Going off that, I think that, okay, yeah, maybe globally it might magically work out, but I think, not a lot of people are going to want to be necessarily travelling to wherever just to find a counterpart. And I think that feminism is just looking at one side of it as far as males and females. And I think as best that we can, there should be approximately an even distribution amongst all countries / areas, as best we can, obviously. But I think deciding that is kind of as you said, in Canada there's all girls, so then we're going to have a heap of girls in Canada, and then they have to go elsewhere to find a partner because there's just so little males. I think it's quite hard and unethical to have such a bias in areas.
Okay.
So based on that then, because we do see in like you're saying, different countries, they do have a bias towards one gender. So wouldn't it then be a logical argument to say, look, you can't select it. Naturally, we end up with 50-50 anyway. Let's just go with that.
I think that the feminist perspective is based on the fact that mostly males are sought, but I also think that often in these situations, a response where I'd say a lot of boys were born, that ultimately further down the line there's going to be a lack of women, which will possibly cause a weighting the other way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you're saying that currently it's swinging towards males, and that eventually it may swing back the other way because there's a greater need for them. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah.
I understand the gender selection as far as biologically the need of there's more males or females, so you're going to want more of the opposite sex that's lacking. But I think at the end of the day, I think playing God, as like you said, I think is wrong as far as playing God to the extent that it's going to go the other way anyway. Like, obviously, I think if it was drastic, then it might possibly be something we could look at. If there was like a 30-70 scenario or something like that, then okay, maybe that could be something that could be used to balance it out. But in general, if there's only a slight difference, I think that it's not a good argument as far as balancing it out. If it's like, say, 45 to 55, I think that's kind of just naturally what should balance itself out, and that's not up to us to choose.
Well, that's interesting. So you say, because in India there is actually quite a big bias. So I've seen it as low as 800 females, 830 I think it was, for every 1,000 males. So it is quite a big spin sort of thing that culturally has occurred. Looking at some of the other arguments, though, do you think religion should be playing a part? So, for example, I found in Israel, there was a Jewish couple, and he was a Cohen, which I believe is some sort of religious figure. That the male then has to perform, the male son has to perform certain tasks. So for him to have a child, they opted to have a female, so that so there was no question on whether he was the son or anything like that. Do you think that we should be allowed to choose based off religion then as well?
I personally don't see how. I think, like, I understand the point, but I think at the end of the day, if you give everybody the choice, then it can be easily just go horribly wrong, basically. Like, if you give everyone the choice of, oh, so your first baby, do you want a boy or a girl? Second baby, do you want a boy or a girl? Based on anything such as like religion or family balancing and stuff like that, I think it will just basically, everyone's going to have their own opinions on what they want, and that's going to be different for each country and each individual. And I think that's not something that we should be playing with personally.
Okay, awesome. I just realised we're running out of time, so we'll move on to the next slide.
Attribution selection. So we have for and against points, which I go through. It's cultural preferences and shared parents' attributes. And the against points is it's an invasion of human dignity. Normal embryos are discarded just because they do not have the desired attribute, and negative consequences for the psychological development of children. Also, resources could be better utilized.
Sorry, we just have a question for this topic. So where do you think this is going with attribution selection? Well, first gender selection, and then we have the attribution selection. Where do you think this is going, and where do we draw the line?
I mean, that's a really interesting question that probably gets to the crux of the matter, isn't it? And whether there can be a general consensus based on a common set of circumstances, or whether it does need to be on a case-by-case basis, is something that we've already discussed in the group. But this idea of sharing parents' attributes on the foresight is a really interesting one. There was, in fact, a case in the United States of a homosexual couple who actually elected to have a child with hearing impairment because they were both hearing impaired. And their argument was that their child would need to actually belong to the same deaf community that they did, and to actually be non-hearing impaired would result in being ostracised and alienated within the community to which they belonged.
Yeah, exactly.
We make the assumption that we're picking attributes that limiting or considered to be a disadvantage.
Yeah, exactly. Are we limiting the capabilities of the child by doing this?
Yeah, but where do we draw the line? Is that something that is ethical, or are we making a value judgment based on the right to life and the quality of life? Are we being challenged to consider the diversity? I mean, I don't know. I'll let you guys actually make up your own mind about that. I certainly have my own thoughts, but the question of the slippery slope becomes all important when we actually start considering what should be permitted and what shouldn't be, and whether we can get consensus or not at that common level, or whether, like I said, it does need to be on a case-by-case basis. We continue.
Sorry to interrupt, Liz, but going on of what you said with the deaf couple, I think that also considers you have to consider what's best for the child, and but then there's also how much autonomy should the parents get. I think those are really the two sides that you really need to be considering, is how much should the parents get to decide, and the actual result being the child. And like with the deafness, the child could go either way as far as understanding why his or her parents did that, or not understand it to the extent that that they feel disadvantaged amongst others.
So just going back to the question of what is disease, and going back to what we are selecting in the child, various ethnic groups have lower health outcomes. Should we then be selecting genes based on ethnicity as well? That's something else to consider. All right. And that concludes our presentation, I think. Did anyone else have any questions before we play our video? Yep. Do we have time to play the video? Or?
How long is the video, Josh?
It's about 6 or 7 minutes.
I think 5.
Yeah, it's probably a little bit long, but what I can do is if the group would like, I can actually post post a link to a discussion thread or in an announcement, and then that way it can be made available to the group to have a look at. What do you think?
Yeah.
Could you put it in the chat as well, maybe?
Yeah, so it just sums up what we've talked about today, and it gives you some other perspectives on it as well.
That's a good idea. So Josh, if you want to put that the link in the chat for the group, then they can actually save it and have a look at it as well.
Yep, we're just doing that now.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, thank you everybody for your contributions in the tutorial today. So this is our last tutorial, obviously, for the session. So thank you for your contributions throughout the last 11 weeks. I've certainly enjoyed taking these classes. Please, just a couple of reminders that your online contributions do continue for this week. Your major essay is obviously due next Wednesday by 12 a.m. I think that's right, isn't it? By Wednesday by not 12, yes, by 12 a.m., which means you have Wednesday to actually continue working on the essay.
So is it today or tomorrow?
Sorry, kids?
So is it today or tomorrow it's due?
So Wednesday, 12 a.m.
Yeah, so tonight or tomorrow night?
No, tomorrow night.
Tomorrow night, okay.
Yeah. The marks for the major essay will actually be posted once the session formally concludes, not beforehand. So it won't be until the formal university results are actually released. Any final questions or queries? A final note, please do make sure that you actually complete the evaluations, which are live and should be available on Views through the link. Sorry, Janet. You might just need to unmute, Janet.
My question was, in the discussion forum, I noticed that you put your comments in often Thursday mornings. I'd put some in Thursday afternoon, and sort of missed that week's sort of feedback. So what happens in that situation?
No, so I go in at different times, and I actually, it's not just the Thursday morning, I go in regularly throughout the week and at different times. It might just be that particular week. I don't believe that there are any comments that I have actually missed in weeks past.
Okay.
Unless you can alert me to something that I might have missed, but I'm fairly certain that I have no unread. Even if I didn't comment, I've certainly read them. In all of the weeks past, it's only just this week, 11, that I'm yet to attend to.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for your contributions, and all the best.
Thanks, Liz.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Liz.
Thanks.
See ya.